Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Now, the National Economic Dialogue 2023 took place on Monday last, and it's the principal institutional forum for public consultation and discussion on the upcoming budget. The dialogue aims to provide a deliberative forum for stakeholders to participate in an open and inclusive exchange on the upcoming economic and social priorities facing the government. And I'm joined now by a resident economist, Marc Coleman. So, Marc, what were your thoughts on last Monday's National Economic Dialogue 2023?
I started to think of myself, if I was a woman going into a gynecology conference and all of the speakers at that conference were male, how would you expect a woman to react? Obviously quite negatively. The National Economic Dialogue is a good idea in principle, but one important point of consultation, and it's down in several EU directives, on, for example, LEADER. If you're looking for LEADER funds for local initiatives, you need to consult in both the private and the public sector. And the big problem with the National Economic Dialogue for several years is that over 80% of the speakers have been from public sector, usually pensioned academics who haven't really great people as individuals, highly, intelligent and erudite, but no understanding of the real world, no understanding of commerce, competition, or how economics really works in practice. But there's another issue here, and that is that public sector pay is quite high in Ireland relative to the rest of Europe and relative to the private sector. And that's a separate issue in itself. So, as I looked at the National Economic Dialogue, advocating higher taxes for the little people, those of us in the private sector who have to generate it, I felt a little bit like a French peasant just before the French Revolution. If you know your French history, you know that the French aristocracy in the 18th century, they were beneficiaries of the economic system and they didn't have to pay tax themselves. Now, of course, the academics who kind of dominate these processes, they do, of course, pay income tax, but in net terms, they benefit far more from a high tax system because that shores up some of the most generous defined pensions in Europe. So my thinking is really the problem with this dialogue is it's the public sector having a chat with itself about how much tax the rest of us are going to pay to fund its existence. It's not really a dialogue, and it kind of struck me as, in terms of the imbalance between the private and the public sector, it struck me like a gynecological conference where all of the speakers were men. I really think the government needs to move away from this and seriously diversify dialogue, because we're starting to see in the opinion polls the strong feeling across the board that people are not being listened to. And I don't think that's intentional. I don't think any government intentionally doesn't want to listen to people. But I think structures like this are not helping government's case at all.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was our resident economist, Marc Coleman, and Marc will be joining us again next Saturday morning.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.